I'm going to
Also,
go ahead and.
we should have recorded this first part and done like a little side, like following Mechanical Turks tech break.
Do you know, I'm like waiting for somebody to do something about workplace, spaces, right? I mean, I've seen like writers do that. There was some project, and was it Van Ittersum and Lockridge did a piece on like workflows, that book from Michigan. Anyway, how we work and how we write, like how the technologies are integrated into our workflows is like, well, it seems relevant.
Oh, very much, right? Particularly, I mean, as we'll talk about, when those
A good segue.
yeah, when those things that you're integrating are actually active in interesting ways.
As they always have been. And, my hand was hovering over the stream, but I was like, it's rude just to record. Now, I know Zoom does give you this pop up, but just to do it surreptitiously, I was like, I don't want to cross that bridge. I listen to Mark Maron's podcast, and many of them start with just conversation. And then at some point, the person says, when are we going to start? And he's like, oh, he said, it starts when you walk in. We've been recording this whole thing. That's okay, isn't it? But at that point, though, if you say no, what you've revealed is you don't listen to the show,
That's really funny.
Oh,
It kind of backfoots you. You have to say that's okay,
well, isn't there like a law, like, well, in California, you have to say you're recording?
It's a two-party state, I think.
Yeah.
Which
Pennsylvania too, which is where I am. So
well, there you go. I had to do it.
Way to go.
Yeah.
Oh, we're off to a great start. It started great.
Excellent.
We had some tech talk. And then at one point, Jeremy violated Annette's rights in the state of Pennsylvania.
That's right. Surreptitious recording, which I think is also on brand here.
That's true. Yeah. No, Jeremy is, although I think given that we're now on Zoom, right? Isn't Zoom, they just released their new terms of service that in the future they're going to be, they're going to train, they're using our faces right now.
That's right. Our metadata is being trained, using training AI. So
let's just make strange faces to throw off its algorithm. But does everybody have masks we could be wearing during this Zoom conversation?
No, I love it. It makes me think of Tony Stagliano's work on like the kind of countermeasures of surveillance. And like if we could be like wearing weird makeup things or do something like this.
Yeah. It was also at I always forget, it's just SALSA for short, but Society for Language, Science and the Arts. It was a presentation about a choreographer that had done all this research about construction companies using security cameras and then generating algorithms that would know when the workers were working, sort of working, and not working, and then used the algorithm it was using to determine that to then film dances that you could be in your most like relaxed, not working, but it would look as if you were working.
That's amazing.
It was basically a choreographer was like, how can you trick a computer into thinking that you're working when you're not?
The early days of Zoom in COVID, there was circulating, I remember, a hack where you could upload like a background picture, like your away picture, but it would be like a repeating video kind of GIF thing, which like would show you, responding.
That's great.
Isn't that awesome?
I think we all just learned that ourselves.
I know, right?
And I saw students, there was sort of a small sort of cottage industry of things you could do in Zoom classrooms, to not be on camera, to have GIFs of is connecting at certain points, those kind of, interesting antagonists. And in many cases, I don't think they were doing it just to put noise in. They were doing it productively. It was like, I need to do something, or I need to take this test, but look at some other material, because it would track my eye line. So how can I resist that in certain ways? All of this is relevant. of course, to this product we're getting into, because our route into it, at least one of them, the complexities of this third product, as Nathaniel, alluded to, and I was just looking at the email. So it's this theoretical product, and it's unfortunately, well, expectedly, I guess, has become kind of this remainder. It's like the other two products we've done, at points we've been like, well, let's roll that into the third one. And so we've been trying to find a through line into this theoretical piece. And one of the things, as Nathaniel pointed out, is readability, sort of understood broadly. Because in the first piece, when we were doing text mining, that was one of the main things that popped up, was this notion of readability and how it was multiple, right? I mean, when we think, because of our backgrounds, of readability, we tend to think textual readabilities and that kind of thing. But we were seeing it deployed in these kind of scenarios with, it's like, look at this car and circle the damage, right? So you had to have, a knowledge of, this is damage, or this is damage to a significant degree. That's a fender. This looks like, the alignment's been messed up, right? So readability popped out of there, along with trauma, which in the second piece, we followed readability. We decided not to follow trauma, in part because our approach was one that suggested you're not just excavating these texts, you're recreating the experience of them. Because we were going to be posting these Mechanical Turk job posts, sort of our theoretical lens dissuaded us from doing trauma, because when we found these pieces, with sort of evocative titles like Mechanical Turk had me relive my worst experience for 50 cents, these journalistic pieces.
Yeah.
So we put in our method, sort of like, here's why we're not doing that. But we did, these posts based on readability. And so one of the ways we're thinking of getting into this theoretical piece is this notion of the readable, both human and non-human. And it's something that made us interested in your work and related texts, is that notion of readability. And so, as Nathaniel mentioned, one of the things we were looking at is this recent composition studies. I guess it's a special issue, or just a subset of that issue. On that notion of different forms of readability and how that's going to be affecting these models. It's not exactly a question.
No. I mean, I have a lot of responses to it. I think it's such a good prompt. Readability, it makes me think, like, ages ago, I gave some little lightning talk on a parsable world. And there's like I think, and here at Pitt for a while, there was, I think it's still going, but there was understandable pushback, this kind of Institute for Modeling the World. And there's a kind of, I think I listen to a lot of podcasts with the tech guys who are, designing all these technologies. And there's like this kind of assumption that the world can be modeled, right? That like all of the data that's in the world just needs to be converted in some way to be digested by computational methods. And so, there's a utopianism, a completism kind of assumption behind that. And it's like the analog world can be fully transitioned into a discrete world that can be digested by computers. And that's an argument. I don't buy that argument. But it's an argument. And I think it's like actually a kind of dominant argument. And I think this is like where some of the tension is about, say, LLMs or generative AI is, to what degree is intelligence ineffable or uncapturable, or to what degree is it not, some sort of discrete binary thing that can be reproduced by computers? What is not math? What exceeds math? So I don't know. I mean, that's I think a really interesting kind of philosophical question about readability and what are ways that we kind of resist that readability too. And the way that we were opening up talking about that, the kind of resistance to surveillance. It reminds me, of course, of Cory Doctorow's work, which very helpfully kind of points to I mean, as good sci-fi does, right? The kind of end result of like, if we take this further, this is what that looks like. So I mean, that's an initial, response.
Yeah. Well, it's in part too, I mean, sort of some of the stuff that Jeremy's done, right, is thinking about, I mean, I think this ended up on the cutting room floor, but thinking about, right, that in orality, the base unit is like the phoneme, right? In textuality, it's the word.
Graphing.
And sort of Jeremy's argument is in this sort of digital literacy, right? It's actually us, like we're the core thing being read. So that notion of readability, I think, gives a lot of directionality. But I think what you're getting at too is that notion of, and it gets back to sort of why we didn't pursue trauma, is that readability is also an inventive act, right? As opposed to just capturing, right? And the idea, we were coming up with, I don't know if we use this one, but parsability is like another, we were working through all these analogies of readability, because we were seeing some readability would be like doing some, I forget, like emotional mapping of a novel, but it could also be like, this receipt got crumpled and OCR won't work on it, but human beings will be able to tell that's a 4. So this also weird inversion of, like, as we kind of see a lot of in sort of automation stuff, right? That there's things that human beings would parse as really high level cognitive tasks, and low level tasks like reading a receipt are actually both really high level tasks in terms of machine learning, right? It can't do either of those things, right? So you actually need a human eye, both because you need some amorphous human intelligence to make sense of it, but also like the human eye is a better sensor than a camera you might have on a, so there's this really like, but parsing is interesting because it suggests you could parse it differently, which already throws a wrench in the idea of capture, right? That readability is not sucking everything in. Readability is actually making fine-grained distinctions between things, which is also, right, like spotting a busted fender or being able to recognize discrete objects in a flat image and things like that. So
which I think gets to questions, say, about like visual rhetoric, right? Like what, I mean, even like both of you have a lot of things in your background, right? And so like, Jeremy, you asked me not to parse the bed in your background, and Nathaniel, I can see your books and, but I can't quite read them, but, maybe I could recognize some of the spines or, but that's not where I'm supposed to be putting attention right now. Right. But that's, how computers, and it's not something is readable or not readable, right? It's like the different kinds of readers that are engaged in the system and what are their objectives as they're reading through it, foreground, background, that kind of thing that that folks in visual rhetoric do such a good job, for analyzing.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up too, because and in part, right, the piece you shared about 4chan and artificial intelligence, that part of what we're interested in, and but also the sort of visual rhetoric is what we're kind of interested in for this third piece is one of our ways in is around discussions of artificial intelligence, because we're also kind of thinking about like who's the audience for this. So the Where We Are forum you were part of is also helping us think about like, who are we talking to? Because for a while, sometimes it's just us slowly going insane, talking to each other in Zoom, which also behind the scenes replicates how we wrote our dissertations together in a very small room together. So it's weird that we keep coming back to this spatial arrangement.
It always goes back to grad school.
But I've been reading about Habsburg AIs, about models trained on models trained on models. I think we're recreating that as we're grand irony.
But what's interesting to us is what rhetoric potentially brings to bear is in that rhetoric is not embarrassed by the term artificial and artificial intelligence
Mm-hmm.
in the way that we see both sort of opponents of it, right? That's the critique of it. It's not real intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
By that, they mean some kind of naturally present intelligence. And weirdly enough, we could make the argument that proponents of it also weirdly enough think that intelligence is either there or not there. Hence, right, we've noticed that the anxiety around recursion is an interesting tell for us, because it's the idea that this model won't work because you have to keep introducing new things to it. When ideally it would be self-contained, a sort of self-sealing intelligence that would no longer need any output, right? It would also no longer need an artifice. It would just be intelligent, and you wouldn't have to keep giving it stuff from outside. And so it's interesting for us is thinking rhetorically, right? And also, right, this is just, and not just because I'm at St. Louis University, right? Sort of Ong's argument about, right, the most natural thing about particularly writing is its artifice, right? Like that intelligence is always, and you get into notions of extended cognition, right? Like human intelligence is profoundly distributed across other things. And so it's interesting for us too, thinking theoretically, and what rhetoric has to bring is actually sort of leaning into the notion of artifice. And so rather than trying to determine whether something is really intelligent or artificially intelligent, which also strikes us as a ultimately Platonic gambit that doesn't really sort of go anywhere, is like, well, no, what's the artifice with which in this particular intelligence is being generated, which then leads, I think, to the kind of question you're interested in, like with your 4chan bot does. Well, if the artifice is 4chan, you'll get a different kind of intelligent output than if the artifice is something else. So it also, I think, lends us to questions of like the training of visual rhetoric, or questions as you explore, right, of pedagogy. Like, rather than the sort of philosophical context of is this really intelligent or not, we think the much more interesting question is how is this AI being taught, or to go back to that short story, I mean, we've talked about here, the Ted Chiang life cycle of software objects, pretty much proposes that if you want AI that's got like 20 years of common sense experience, it will take you 20 years, right? The idea that AI has to be raised as opposed to programmed, right, already suggests a sort of interesting, if counterintuitive, investment in artifice. Like, no, the artifice is hugely important, as it always is for intelligence, right? What's the LLM that it's being trained on? What sensors are being made available to it? So that's kind of why the end of Antonio Bird's piece in that, where he mentions, right, that every time you write something, imagine it's going to then become part of an LLM that trains something, right? How would that change the way that you wrote? So.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's great. I mean, there's like, I don't know, there's so many responses I have to that. I mean, first, I guess I would ask you, Nathaniel, you say, ideally, we have this self-sealed intelligence, and I am not sure where that's coming from, or what that ideal would be. Like, whose ideal, and
well,
what?
Right. That would be, yeah. In many ways, that would not be something I'm proposing, but I think what we're, at least what I get a sense of is that when you read some of these pieces about artificial intelligence, and particularly reading some of these not journalistic pieces about recursion, what I'm essentially, because we had a conversation earlier about, we kind of get a sense of who our foil is in the humanities. Like, we know who but we weren't, like Jeremy asked, but are we actually making up a foil that doesn't exist in the AI community? Right?
Some straw man, right?
So when we started reading these things about recursion, it's really interesting, because to treat recursion as a problem, right? The idea that our model fails because that model requires occasional interventions from outside of it,
Mm-hmm.
suggests to us that for them, the model that doesn't fail would be a model that would no longer need any additional interaction with something outside of it.
Right. That was the thing I brought up, is if your presumption is it's a flaw or failure, that we need a cadre of humans, as I pulled up there, in this case, low paid people in Kenya, to keep the thing on the rails, right? To keep it from skewing into monstrous bias, to keep it from hallucinating yokos, right? The yo-yo spiral hybrid. If you see those as flaws, it's like, yeah, but we still need, in this case, Amazon Mechanical Turks. We need these low-paid humans to do their human prodding to keep it on the rails. If we see that as a flaw, then that's the model potential we're pushing back against, where it's, well, no, what human would you seal off in a room? And that's the mental health of solitary confinement, where it's like they don't encounter other people. Is it a surprise they come out a little different than we would anticipate, right? Why is it weird that an AI needs other intelligences to keep it in the world of intelligences?
I think it's so interesting, because I think it gets at the central question of how close is artificial intelligence, computational intelligence, to human intelligence? And, what are those things, right? So like AI has all these benchmarks that, make it parsable, right? So like, depending on the benchmark, you hit this, this, and this, and that's some sort of rating for intelligence, right? They're not, for the most part, practicing computer scientists don't want to get too philosophical, right? They want some discrete measure of intelligence, right? And then, and then there's podcasts where they do that, but really it's the benchmarks. But as I listened to the episode from last week, and Nathaniel, you're talking about humanism, which is fascinating, because I feel like we have fundamental differences here, which are maybe generative. But anyway, whatever, human intelligence, right? I'm going to put that in quotes right now. But there's like a kind of, when we're looking at artificial intelligence in that way, we use these metaphors. So you talk about Habsburg AIs, which gets at incest, like sex, like this is like fundamentally a biological thing, right? And when I thought about the way that these LLMs ingest their own output, I think about it as cannibalism, which like eating is another very fundamentally biological process, right? And it's almost like we can't understand these otherworldly whatever things, right, without using some kind of analogy that's like really fundamentally biological. And so I do think that there is a kind of ideal that we might be able to design an intelligence that routes around the kind of faults in humans. And so like you might define a fault in human being the fact that we need sex and we need to eat to continue, that these are kind of places where impurities are imbibed, where we go wrong, So, in that way, I'm coming back to your idea of ideally, Nathaniel, that there might be some kind of, we might be able to design a human that's like a perfect human or something, that would be able to not do these things. It would just be the brain in the vat kind of ideal, which I think is, sometimes the thing that is aspired to in the rhetoric around AI.
Oh yeah, there's you just reminded me of Eric Davis's Technosis.
Oh, I don't know that.
It's a great book where he traces, it's like 30 years old at this point, but he traces the Gnostic heresies, right? The idea that the body is the thing that must be escaped, and that's a big Protestant heresy, which I like to get into. But Protestants all moved to America, right? So there's this, he basically traces that every technology has this kind of Gnostic element to it, right? The idea that you upload your consciousness into, so there's this constant, basically all of what you just pointed out, right? All of our narratives around technology are traceable to this Gnostic cult around like no, Jesus wasn't a body. You can't, that's the thing that must be escaped because, right, it's this shitting sexing machine. And that can only ever get in the way. I caught myself because I wasn't going to say sexing. Which is also that Burt quote, without any preparatory eating, there would be no sexing, which is a Post-it note that's been in our fridge since graduate school, because I turned it into a love note to my wife. Anyway, I got off the rails. Speaking of getting off the rails, but right. So kind of what we're interested in is how, maybe this is now what I'm retroactively thinking we're interested in, right? That our earlier engagements with Mechanical Turks is how is it articulating these things? So the idea is potentially, is there not just that Mechanical Turks is, so it's got, right, the human intelligence task. And what we're interested in is how does the language of these tasks and the arrangements of this task, what does it think that human intelligence is?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, we're kind of interested in not theorizing about Mechanical Turks, but what theory of human intelligence is Mechanical Turks generating, right? And there really is some interesting stuff around, like, what is the human body good for and what isn't it good for? Like, when do we need a body to do this? Well, it's when we need to, like, feel emotions and parse images that we're having a hard time parsing, right?
That was one of the kind of really interesting things in the first piece. We kind of went into it with the idea that this will limit what humans do because of, just like, economic forces drive tasks to Amazon's Mechanical Turk that are difficult for machine intelligence for a range of reasons. And, like, we weren't even necessarily theorizing that, but it's like, well, therefore the tasks that are there are things that are, like, endemically human right now, because it's just doesn't make economic sense to have them do it when a machine could do it cheaply. So it's like, whatever is there has to be human. And what we were finding were things like reading and suffering, right? You need humans to tell you what human suffering is like, right? We kind of kept bumping up against how the IRB is, you're a human if you are at risk, right? Mm-hmm. And so, this notion of, like, well, then what does this show us? What's its image of the human that comes out of that? To an extent, we're still dealing with that, while dealing with this notion of, and I don't know where you sort of fall on this, the ways in which we don't see the human as this kind of special magical thing, but possibly something that is difficult for us to escape, right? I mean, it's, this recurrent issue, I won't say problem, but this recurrent issue of, in a sense, we're always viewing this through probably inescapably our own lens, right? I mean, as you mentioned, in terms of, like, metaphors, there's probably no way for us to objectively observe this. We're always looking out through our own eyes. So is there a futility, or what do we do with that possibly inherent subjectivity,
I mean, I think that's a feature, not a bug.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's like, you could approach this as a kind of Heisenberg and certainly principle, you can't measure it and observe it at the same time, right? Or you could say, like, we are making artificial intelligence in our own image.
Yeah.
And I think that's just inexcapably true. And so I'm working on a book right now where I'm looking at writing as a kind of crucible for artificial intelligence across a number of different centuries and approaches. And so what I'm working on right now is the 18th century and all of these androids and automata that were designed, which are, just like the most interesting stuff, right? This is like total Mechanical Turk. Like, this is right.
No, Mechanical Turk, yeah.
Yeah, it's Mechanical Turk, right? And what's interesting, of course, about that was it was a fraud. And I'm sure are aware of Vaucanson's defecating duck, which was also a kind of, it wasn't artificial intelligence, but it was simulating some sort of biological mechanism. And it was part of that group of, like, how do we recreate something biological? Like, we don't think that, or it's like really kind of philosophically interesting, especially in the 18th century, when there's like this mechanist philosophy that we are all just mechanisms, right? There's not something outside of this mechanism. It is just the body, right? It's just that God works with finer tools than we do. So like if we had better stuff and we were like a little better at it, then we could also recreate life. And so here's this duck that Jacques Vaucanson did and, displayed in Paris in, I think, 1738, and along with, humans who are like playing a flute and like doing more kinds of human, like behaviors, but this duck that could, also a fraud, but, could simulate that it was pooping, like that's fascinating, right? Because like we don't imagine machines doing that. This is a fundamentally biological thing, right?
I mean, a quick pitch would be great if you wrote like an alternate history where Charles Babbage doesn't see the mechanical Turk, but he sees the shitting duck. Right. I mean, well, we've had that, right?
Suddenly we have
what is it about? Like, what if it hadn't been chess?
Yeah.
But it had been writing, right? Because chess is this.
Yeah.
Literally, like, there's articles now, like, chess has been solved. Like, chess is actually mappable.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So what is it about? Like, and I'm also thinking, right, the movie War Games. Like, what if it had been tic-tac-toe? Or something else, right? That the thing that this gets back to like the thing that it's trained on. The thing I think is the LLM is chess, right? That's all.
No, I love that. This is I think you must be alluding to this, right? Nathan Ensminger's article on is chess the Drosophila a science, or of AI, which is, basically he goes through and he talks about how, chess has been the Drosophila. Like this is the main organism that's like easy for us to experiment on and to reproduce. And, again, like this is a super complex system, but it's entirely parsable, so like you can, you can throw computers and math at it and make it make sense. But what is the game of chess is something else. And but that's an interesting, I love that. I mean, that could be a good sci-fi prompt, right? Like imagine artificial intelligence that evolves, in some sort of,
I think it would be, you'd have to get Octavia Butler to write it. Because right, like all of her intelligences, it's all biological, right? I love that. They're living organisms, right? Like, no, this is shitting duck sci-fi, and then this is mechanical Turk. Yeah, that's a.
What you could do is take Claude AI and like feed it all of Octavia Butler's work, and then produce, some sort of that. I mean, that would be a fun experiment.
Although ChatGPT doesn't like my sci-fi prompts.
Oh.
Or if Babbage saw, instead of the mechanical Turk, something growing and shifted into organic computing or something like that. Or my favorite one to imagine is, because computers now, you can make an argument that computers are fundamentally calculators, right? That they're based on the binary bit. You could say at a fundamental level, the chip is doing zeros and ones, pulse, non-pulse. That's what it's doing. It's a counter, right? And all this stuff is based on that. My favorite one to imagine is, what if instead of teaching it to count, we taught it the alphabet, right? So instead of being a big calculator, it was some kind of big word thing, right? A talker instead of a counter.
But that's still a discrete system. I mean, that's the thing, right? And so like, I think about, say these 18th century and earlier automata, some of them tried to tackle speech, which is not a discrete parsable thing, and so they made some headway, but not really, it wasn't impressive. And so if you think about writing as a kind of discrete system, right, at least, like print writing. Now, handwriting is different. And actually what's interesting, I think one of the kind of big questions I have actually that I'm like trying to think through is like, why these 18th century automata in the age of print hand wrote? Because I think, that was a fundamental human thing. rather than say printing. Like already the printing press existed. So this was not impressive, to produce something that printed. Right. And so like the handwriting could go along with piano playing or flute playing or, shitting. Like these are biological things that the only entities we know who produce these behaviors are biological.
It really reminds me, and this you may know, but a lot of the stuff that Tim Ingold writes, and because he writes a lot about, he's got a whole book about lines, and he makes the distinction between wayfaring and transport. And wayfaring is when you go like along, but it's represented as one continuous line, whereas transport is like these dotted lines as you move sort of across the surface. But he juxtaposes, right, cursive to printing, because one is like discrete, whereas I lost the thread of this. Literally, I lost the thread of this, right? The sort of continuous movements, right? So cursive is like the same way that when you digest food, right, it doesn't move from point A to point B, right? It moves along the whole,
It's an analog system.
Yeah, right, as opposed to the digital. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, let me ask something then, because printing came up for us in terms of readability and legibility, because what has become most legible is printing, right? Kids don't even learn cursive. And one of the reasons why this is readable is because it's machine readable, right? Because letters are sorted and print helps them, right? So readability, legibility was a growing together of different kinds of readers, human readers, non-humans, human readers. And we made a lingua franca, I said franca of, this is what readable is, because there's lots of us in here doing this, right? Now, I wanted to bring that up because a term you've used a couple of times now is fraud, right? It's fraudulent. And this is something that's tricky for us. And we recently were talking about this because there's a sense in which, is the Mechanical Turk, are those automata frauds, or they're just not what we want, right? I mean, there's a sense in which they're not frauds, they're themselves. Mm-hmm. We call them frauds because what we want to see is our face in the black mirror, right? We want to look at you and see ourselves. And we go at great lengths to make sure that doesn't happen, because we need them also to be other. We need to look at you and say, but you're not actually us because you can't do X. And we keep pushing that, right? At different times we say, because you can't reproduce, you can't eat and shit, right? When it's that, when they can do work, we say, okay, well, it's not that. When they can do chess, we say it's not that. When they can think, it's not that, right? We need them to both be us and not be us. And so we're always, Nathaniel and I are wrestling with this question of, are they frauds? And like Dr. Kang, I think, so they're not frauds, right? They are what they are, right? Where do you land on that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think they're frauds in the sense that the way that they were presented suggested that they were more than they actually were, right? That like it was actually doing digestion. It was actually, the mechanism was playing the chess, not the human in the machine. So I think on that kind of very simple definitional level, it's fraud because there's a gap there, there's deception involved, right? They wouldn't pass IRB, or at least they'd have to go through an extra
declare it.
So, but there's a kind of showmanship. And I think what's interesting about that is that I think, I mean, this is a rhetorical situation. So if you're presenting the Mechanical Turk, like people want to believe, they want to be part of that fiction, so if you imagine yourself at a magic show, ultimately, like, okay, they're not actually producing a rabbit out of the hat. The hat is not making a rabbit. We understand, that is not a possible thing. There is no possible world where that's a thing that's happening that's not a fraud, right? But what we're interested in is, wow, my brain thinks that, but like my rational brain is like overriding that. And I think that tension is a very pleasurable tension. And so that kind of belief, this gets at, say the Blake Lemoine, thing that happened maybe a year ago or whatever, where he was like, oh, this is actually AI. Like, I believe this is AI. And there's a kind of or, you know, I believe it's sentient, I guess.
Right, yeah.
You know, that there's a kind of, if you have somebody on the other end of this exchange fully engaged in that kind of belief, does that change the kind of communicative situation there? Or do we want to subscribe to that? And I think, you know, I mean, I'm going to say that's probably a human drive, right? Is to be like engaged willfully in fiction.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, that also, I mean, if I'm correct, like, I mean, you've also just described, like, that's the Turing test.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you, I
Fooled.
attribute this must be not a robot. This must be, yeah. Well, it's really interesting too, right? Because we had, Dr. Minsu Kang on, who wrote a book about, right, and talked about how the metaphors keep changing. So for a while, like, vegetable was a good thing to be, whereas now it's the opposite.
Yeah.
Even the shift between autonomy and automaton, right? They're basically, like, weirdly, they mean opposite things, but they're basically the same word. It's, I mean,
yeah, they move by themselves, but
like they're weirdly, like, the way that one, you either have autonomy or you're automat, like, those etymologically are, but that the history of how those grew apart is like testament to,
yeah.
you know, I mean, I think at one point I even tweeted out, like, the category of the human is just an ontological miscellaneous bin.
Yeah.
Like, it's whatever's left after we, well, no, it turns out that apes use tools to get termites out of mounds. Well, so it's not tool, like, it's just, it's the, whatever the human is, it almost feels like it's a rear guard action. Like, it's whatever, well, it's okay. Maybe it's not language, you know, apparently it's not funerary practices, because there was a hominid species 200,000 years ago that maybe also buried their dead. So it's really interesting. But anyway, I was going with that, but like, but partially, I don't know, the relation between fraudulent and then the way that we're interested in the term artificial is kind of interesting, which is, there is something about that social attribution of intelligence that's important, right? I mean, I'm even thinking of Carolyn Miller's, right, the attribution of agency. Like, the notion of agency is always something that has to be attributed to be recognized. So there's this really interesting sort of engagement with it. It could all be, you know, in a kind of really not anti-Platonic, but right. Yeah, no, it might all be fraudulent, right? But it still generates the effect of intelligence, right? Particularly as you start thinking about, I mean, my own sort of forays into posthumanism and the way that they're also informed by, like, disability studies, right? You start getting into this notion of what constitutes the human in order to differentiate the human from the machine. There's lots of potentially humans that don't meet that category as well, right? And so it starts to get really interesting when you start making that parse and needing to parse it in some ways, like what drives that to want to be able to spot what's truly this or artificially so, right? Runs into, particularly as you start, I mean, I was having a conversation with somebody, I forget now who, but the way that automated labor has linkages to things like slavery and, right, the use of bodies. So it's as we've discovered at this project, right, we get very close into other areas that we're not supremely confident entering into, right? Like, I think we were talking last time, like, we're not really economists.
We're not economists. We're not labor scholars. You know, we're not ethicists. It's like, what's left for us to do? Read
right.
about it, you know?
But it seems like all of those, right, that rhetorical situation you're describing, all of those are there, right? I think that's what makes AI so interesting, is if the more you get into it, like, well, no, you got to talk about bodies now. You got to talk about labor. You have to talk about, right, all these things are, right, they're all hidden inside the cabinet
It's
the
true.
Turk is
I
in.
mean, that's the limit of disciplinarity, right? Like disciplinarity is an attempt to parse the world in a way that like, it's just not like that. Like real world is not like, here is a problem that's like fully discreetly, tackleable by labor scholars. Like, no, obviously like it's also, and I think that, I mean, this is one of the interesting things when we try to, as humanists, rhetoricians, whatever other kind of like other disciplines trying to like wedge our way into the discourse of AI, there's a kind of pushback from some of the AI technologists that say, like, if you can't write your own LLM, like, what are you doing here? Or if, there's a kind of, but, I mean, it's a fundamentally interdisciplinary space that has a history, that has a context that, and that context includes slavery and disability and, all sorts of things that, that are really important to consider as we think about technologies as they get, and I'm going to use this word intentionally, deployed into the real world. And I think, I mean, I think that's an important space to keep pushing back. Like we do belong here thinking about these things because they are not fully discrete or isolated into some sort of, experimental situation.
Yeah. It's to me, it's potentially reminiscent of on a gun violence discourse where, you will see positions, and this is a little hyperbolic, but not that much, where they'll say, you're calling an AR-15 an assault rifle, so you don't get to talk here. And a person is saying, I just don't want to get shot, right? Yeah. I don't know what that is. I can't make a gun. I can't recognize it, but I do know that my kid got shot by one. So I maybe have a seat at this, right? Because there's a part of me in our discourse where it's like, to an extent, I don't care what the human is. I really don't. What I care about is what those ad hoc definitions rest upon and do. I care about where they come from and what they're doing. I don't really care what a human is, but I care to the extent if things are getting legal rights, right? I mean, corporations are the thin edge of the wedge to get small sort of rights that are quasi-human. I care if this being called not human allows us to abuse certain classes of seemingly alive human being, right? So yeah, I mean, there's this question of, it's like the definition, I think for us, is what we're trying to step away from, the kind of, philosophical resolving of the human, but we're looking at, but what are its causes and effects, right? And that's intelligence, right? I mean,
and I think, I mean, this is where I'm actually, I'm interested because, Nathaniel, in your last episode, you were talking about the, the humanist, and like kind of resistance to the humanist. And I think, I mean, that's where I come down. And, it's not, there is no the human. I mean, this is the like fundamental hubris of most of these AI guys, and I'm going to use that word intentionally too, is, Simon Newell, mid-century, they're, I mean, Herb Simon was like deliberately trying to reproduce his own intelligence, in early AI research. And like, that's fine. Like, that's how it goes. But like, it's just that, like, if you assume that that is human intelligence, like my intelligence is human intelligence, like that equation doesn't work. I have a human intelligence and I am a human, and that is like on the ground. And this is where I feel like I get into like a Wittgenstein kind of approach to definition, that there is something phenomenologically real about me as a human, and my human life and my children and my, interactions and friends and, these kinds of like our everyday lives, right? And then we get into this philosophical realm where suddenly it's the human, and, I mean, like, and that's where it all breaks down. Like, I don't, that's not a defensible space. But if we think about humans in this kind of broad category, that some of them are going to fit into this definition like this, and some of them are going to fit into this definition of that, but it's, it's an overlapping Venn diagram, which is not fully, you cannot draw a circle around the whole thing, right? Because you will, in any circle, you're going to leave out some people who we would describe as human. And I mean, of course, this is not to get into this, but this is obviously a fundamental question in terms about abortion. And
Yeah.
so I just think it's really crucial for us to consider that despite the fact that we cannot draw this circle comprehensively, it is still an operational construct that matters.
Mm-hmm.
We matter, rights matter. And I think it's a really just a dangerous philosophical position to just circumvent that.
Yeah.
Because that's where we get, I mean, and you listen to the podcast and it really is like you hear about the rights of artificial intelligences and of robots. And I just do not buy it. Yeah. I just don't see that as parallel, as equivalent to human rights.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to back you into a corner, but do you see a scenario where it could, right? You mentioned the case of the Google researcher who said, I think Lambda, because it told me I don't want to be shut off, and that's my threshold, right? And, certainly it's like we can dismiss that. I think probably I would to me, it's kind of interesting because someone said, I have a pull quote, because of course I do, that was, he's mistaking linguistic savvy for true intelligence. And I was like, well, holy shit, what's the difference,
Yeah.
But your statement, yeah, but I mean, can you envision a scenario where if they're not human rights, there's a broader notion of intelligence rights? I mean, what do you think of the cases where, river systems in other countries are being granted partial human rights really as a legal means to prevent them from being fouled so badly? I mean, really, it's an adjunct to human rights, because it's like what we're really worried about here is poisoning ourselves, seemingly, or economic things, right? But I mean, where do you stand on those kinds of things? Like not human, but like intelligence rights or something like that.
It's an interesting question. I mean, in that too is like, environmental rights, what are the rights of trees to live? What are the rights of squirrels and, endangered species and things like that? And I mean, I think that's where posthumanism is like, to me, it works there, that we can't just think about the centering of the human in terms of everything. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would just this is a cop out, but I am totally not an authority on those kinds of things. So I feel, I mean, if it doesn't want to be turned off, it shouldn't be turned off. That's a threshold for human, right? But did that apply to my, 2-week-old daughter? Well, I guess there's a biological drive, they want to eat. You could interpret that as a a kind of continuance, desire to continue, but that's I mean, not true for all babies. So this is obviously not I think a threshold that could be, again, a fully definable, this is something that we could give rights to. I just think, I mean, I guess, again, this is a cop-out, but just, I think it's important for us to consider the implications of any of these decisions. And, I mean, when you say, Jeremy, that there's a kind of adjunct, in looking at river rights like that, I mean, that's just the way the law works. Is it it has to work by analogy, because it's working from pre-existing systems.
Yeah.
And so that's the only way that reasoning works in that space. You can't just de novo come up with some sort of well, we should give rights to rivers because, right? I mean, so, and that's how, how the corporation thing works too, is well, they're like people, and nobody would define a corporation as an actual person, right? But it's still reasoning by analogy.
Unless you really want to spend a lot of money on your political cause, in which case.
Unless you're Mitt Romney. But what's also, I mean, too, right, go back, I mean, I think what we're also interested in, or is analogously interested in, is the whole discourse of rights is already predicated in a certain kind of liberal humanist tradition, right? The idea of rights already presumes an autonomous individual.
That's right.
what if
That's
the
right.
language was not rights, but obligation or
Yeah,
something, right?
responsibilities. I think this is huge. I think that's a
So that,
really important
so,
point.
so for us, what's interesting too is, right, even that, yeah, the legal discourse of, well, does it have rights or not? Is it a human or not? Is
Mhm.
already bound up in a tradition that deserves to be unpacked. I mean, I was just reading, what's it called? Becoming Imam Jackson. Look, there's a lot of, particularly in the intersections of African American studies and post-humanism, that like literally just traces the development of the concept of the human is historically quite strongly correlated with the emergence of the slave trade, with the opening gambits of colony. Like all of a sudden, Europeans go to North America and discover groups of humans living radically different from the way that they're living. All of a sudden, you start seeing people debating what man is.
Yeah.
Whereas the previous century, nobody gave a shit because they didn't need to parse it, right? So this whole notion of being able to parse the human itself has not been a lifetime universal pursuit of human beings. It's largely the point of like, we need their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they're different than us. Is there a way we could use that difference to get their stuff, right? I mean, the interesting, and also just the Wingrove and Graeber's The Dawn of Everything, right? They traced like the use of terms like equality and inequality are actually still historically pretty recent, the use of those terms to describe, but they're contingent upon, Jesuit priests interacting with indigenous Iroquois in North America. Be like, oh, how do they live very different than us? How do we explain that? Because we thought human beings they did this. And I realized like they do this, they don't seem to have top-down authority. They potentially don't seem to have notions of property that we have. Holy shit. What do? We need a definition. We need to have a debate about this, right? And so
Equality is also a math term, by the way.
What's that?
Equality is also a math term, by the way.
Well,
right?
yeah, but
Thinking of things as equal or unequal,
Yeah, but used in the context of human it's really interesting how these things emerge historically, right? So it's in many ways that Jeremy did back you into a corner, but not with the like, well, I would use it here, but not here, but in the sense that thinking about it in terms of rights bestowed upon discrete things, that's the corner, right? You're already backed in a corner because you have to think of discreteness and right. And I think what's interesting about for us is that what AI is doing that's interesting theoretically is it's really making, as you point out, even disciplinarity, it's making discreteness, it's exposing the weakness of that mode of reading. Like this is simply not something that autonomy is going to help us work through.
Yeah. I think I really love the way that you put that. Because I think that's true. And I think LLMs are, of course, like they're simulating collective intelligence. They're not simulating some individual intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Which is one of the more interesting things about it. It's statistical based on a kind of wide group of people. And as you know, since you've been mentioning Antonio's piece, when Antonio Bird is arguing about this in composition studies, I mean, he points out, I mean, it's a brilliant piece, but he's looking at like the representation in the data sets, which, of course, a lot of people have pointed out, this is not representative of humans, generally, right? It's just like, where's the writing on the web and, what gets sucked in, and we only know part of it and all these kinds of things. But we do know that it's not going to represent minoritized discourses particularly well because they're minoritized, like it's literally definitional. So, then, what does that mean for us? And, and he points out too, the kind of ways that literacy studies and, our approach to pedagogy has been complicit in literacy crises and, kind of standard American English and all these kinds of things. So Nathaniel, when you point out the this like philosophical debate about the human is like complicit in slavery, and how do we take their stuff, and how do we, okay, so like we meet the species definition, we can interbreed, we can, whatever, right? Like all these things, but yet we know that we're fundamentally different in some conceptual, philosophical, intellectual way. So you need to do, rhetoric, philosophy, or whatever to kind of do somersaults around the actual fact that we are all human.
No, no, and that's, I mean, the standard probably is as all of us as are currently or past or present or future WPAs, right? I was having a conversation with our placement director or the overseer. So I do placement for English, and the worry, like, are you worried about people using, Chat GPT to write their answers? I'm like, well, first of all, we can't know whether they've done it. There seems to be no reliable way of doing it. And I also put in there, and I say this as someone who's written and graded placement exams. Placement exams are tailor-made for AI generated, right? We're looking for more or less competent usage of language that recognizes genre.
Yeah.
Well, that's what, like, why is all of a sudden we're now, higher ed is worried about Chat GPT? Because we had the socket already there for it to plug into.
It's true. And that's a question of agency, right? So like those kinds of placement paradigms mean the institution has the agency in placement. And, there's the counter measure of self-placement in those spaces, which, to the degree that I know that it's like very inconsistently, able to kind of, I know that from implementing that here at Pitt, but that there is a kind of like, okay, well, we're just going to chuck the kind of idea that we can decide this anyway, but like, what do you want? Where do you see yourself? Where do as a student, how are you going to take this agency and move through the institution in a different way? And I mean, maybe to transition, because you'd asked me about this, the composition studies article or little think piece that I wrote, and you'd mentioned Ted Underwood's piece too, recent blog post, which I think is also very good on this, is thinking about how do we fundamentally need to think about how we're teaching, and kind of go not in a back to basics way, as Antonio like very helpfully like, this is not what we're doing, but in a fundamental, like, what are we here for kind of way.
No, and I think I really dig that, because I think it gets back to the theory that Mechanical Turks is doing, this notion of the task, like that both human and intelligence emerges in a particular task.
Yeah.
So what's the taskate of higher ed? And what kinds of intelligence do we want to generate? So for us, that's why we like leveraging the notion of artificial, because it puts the onus on the artifice, which is, you don't need to demonstrate, student that I haven't met, that you are intelligent enough to be here. Is what if we rethought the place or higher ed as a taskate that will allow for certain kinds of intelligences to emerge or flourish or not? So I think too that what rhetoric can usefully do is put the onus back on the kind of institutionality of what tasks are we assigning students, and how do what intelligences and versions of the human are assumed by those tasks. And what we've learned is a lot of the writing we seem to be assigning that task generates this kind of intelligence. And then of course you factor in all the labor stuff, well, the incentive structures, right? Like, given the kinds of writing we expect and how your average student is sold on higher ed, I'm not sure why they don't all do this, right?
And also our institutional need, as you mentioned, to place them. I mean, you're dealing with, tens of thousands of students. It's the grade argument as well. It's like, how do you process that much matter without some automatic sorted system?
That's right. It's parsing students, right? And it's parsing their work and we are already, this is why computers are such a threat, because we are already in an automated system that, grades students in discrete ways. And so, I mean, that makes it legible to other institutions, so like they can use GPAs and transcripts and, like what does a GPA say about a student? I got a 3.6. I am a 3.6 student. Like, what does that mean? This is like, it's when you put it like that, I feel like it's like, it's very clearly like looking at the analog work of a student and who a student is into some sort of digital space. And that's how information circulates. And the information, we're already there, but this is what Babbage saw, is that, he's looking at industrialization and manufacture. And he says, well, could the, intellectual labor be automated in the same way that physical labor is? And that's the problem that he aimed to solve. And, that's why we are where we are.
It's really interesting. Oh, sorry. It was just in the WPA space, because one of the moves, and, this conversation is still happening. I mean, I'm talking to our comp folks next week, understandably, like one of the moves in the what do we do now space was, well, let's go back to like conversation, oral disputation. And, I was like, well, we're not ready to revert to the medieval university. And one of the main reasons why is you do not give instructors the ability to make judgment calls about students in that way, right? Imagine a grade dispute where your defense is, I didn't like what they were saying. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's like the institution as such, there is no way that we are structured for that kind of thing. And, if your grade is based on, I'm going to talk to you for a while and that's going to be your grade, we do not give instructors that kind of agency. They have to armor themselves with, well, this is the test and here's what he got on it. Or here are the highlighted plagiarized passages, right? You have to armor yourself. And even then, usually institutions like, just give them a C and rubber stamp it because it's the institution.
Yeah. And it's shaped on the outside by legalistic regimes where, the student, of course, can push back against this. And, this is why, like in, grade disputes and things like that, in physics, they can say, well, you got a 52 on the exam. So shrug, like, it's a 52. There's a number. There's a kind of faith in numbers versus here's a subjective decision based on your rhetoric professor's, decision about your oral history. One is no more subjective than the other, but there is a kind of privilege given to the number.
Particularly when in the context of rhetoric, your instructor is probably already ambivalent about the task of assessing you because, well, the shit speech you just gave me is only shit because you gave it to me, right? I mean, we don't even think that there's a document there that can be assessed independent of its operation in a context. Like, this is the conversation I always have with assessment. It's like, yeah, but they didn't write it for assessors. So how could you, rhetoric is that's a perennial problem in rhetoric, which is how do you teach it? Because the joke is funny because this person laughed and not funny because that person didn't laugh.
I mean, classrooms are models of the world, right? And like to the degree that they're, reproducing what kind of world, like what are they reproducing? What's the point? There's like, we can just run in circles about second guessing them.
The teacher just didn't like me. You're right. That's because what you did was bad.
Right, yeah. You play favorites. I do, but you need to understand my criteria for favorites is the rubric. That's by the way, that's what I tell my children, not my students. Because
you give your children rubrics?
Well, because, I get complaints about not loving them enough. And so I give them the rubric that says, well, this week you were pretty bad on affection. So you've dropped in it's monstrous. I bet Jeremy.
I want to see your parenting podcast or your parenting advice, like parenting from a rhetorician, whatever.
It's first and foremost, the biggest problem with it, it's way too self-reflexive. It's just like, you know what, just do it and don't think about it 3 o'clock in the morning, please.
I don't parent like that, but I will admit that there was a time that I had a spreadsheet of favors I had done for others and ones they had done for me. Eventually, Deanna, I think, was like, you have to stop this. She was right, but
boy, does that track.
Wow. Wow.
Just so I knew
amazing.
where the balance was.
That's amazing. I mean, this makes me think about the intersection and the discussion of the tech world is like, it's fully embedded in this kind of, how do you optimize yourself and your relationships, right? Like, how do you, make yourself more efficient, more productive? How do you, I mean, Jeremy, it sounds to me like you're quantifying relationships in a way that's like, I mean, it's interesting. It's not wrong exactly. It's just like it's a totally different paradigm.
It's monstrous. You can
It's wrong, I admit. Yeah.
Well, but it goes back to your earlier point.
Uh-oh.
Like, the Enlightenment happens at the same time the Industrial Revolution happens.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that in tech, we see these very Western Enlightenment notions of intelligence woven seamlessly into notions of efficiency and parsability, right? That those are not historical accidents.
Yeah.
That when we were dividing up the factory floor, we were also dividing up the mind, and then dividing up higher ed into disciplines, right?
Yeah.
Like, no, this is where chemistry happens. This is where biology happens. This is where math happens. And there's a bell that rings so that, there's that great, I forget his name, Robinson, but he did a Royal Society for the Arts, and they made it into like a animated whiteboard talk. But he gives this talk about the joining of those two things, right? That we divide the way that schools function along factory lines.
Yeah.
Children are basically raised in batches because the most important part of children is their date of manufacture, right? Like, you were all born this year, so you must all be at the same level, right? So all 10-year-olds get educated alongside other 10-year-olds, and then 11-year-olds, and right that. So of course we see, tech bros with notions of brains in a vat that you can also use to make yourself more economically efficient.
Yeah.
Right? That's not an accident. That's,
This is
that's a feature.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Lorraine Daston's work on this is like so brilliant. She's a history of science scholar, and she's got a piece called Enlightenment Calculations, where she's looking at literally the kind of inspiration. And she talks about automation and AI being twinned at birth. This kind of she charts this 18th century guy who automated a pin factory, or he's like automating mechanical calculations of math things, like the navigational, like all the kind of stuff that they had to do pre-computers, and likening it to this pin factory from Diderot. And it's very interesting, because it's like if you look at the actual design of computers, they are like factories, right? There's like managers, and like there's kind of layers of systems, right? And underneath are kind of the low skill, like binary calculations kind of layer. And when you're talking about mechanical Turks too, like, right, that it's the same system. You have somebody directing, and then like what you have is these hits that are like, they're parsable. Like, any human should be able to tell these kinds of things, right? So like there's a kind of assumption of substitution of no human is unique. Like, they should all be able to come up with the same answer, and it's a human task, but it's that like that's a fundamentally base principle for automation. And I think that's, that's built into software engineering too. So like if you look at the design from Lisp, which doesn't work like that as a programming language, to say, Java frameworks or whatever, like the object-oriented paradigm, which is like much more, that you black box things in object orientation. And it's like by black boxing it, using libraries or whatever, like you can swap things out seamlessly in the same way that you might be able to swap out, low-level software engineers that are programmers or whatever, right? So like, this is like baked into the whole system. And when you look at like programmers and the way that they're talking about their use of LLMs, like Copilot or whatever, integrating into their workflows, what they say is that, like for high level programmers, like it's still, I mean, like they're still needed, right? But like it's automating out all the like junior programmers kind of stuff. And that's been always the way, like, I mean, Mechanical Turks, they're only useful until AI can automate out that human part, right? Like that's clearly the goal. To be able to automate out that lower level. And then, it might move up, but, there's still things that like stubbornly resist, does this look like a 4? Is this a 4? Is this not, know?
And what we noticed too, is that a lot of the jobs, a lot of the hits are designed to no longer need hits. I mean, a lot of the hits are just like, you're helping us train the bot to do this.
Yeah. You're training your replacement.
These are self-eliminating jobs.
Yeah.
Dig your grave.
Yeah. Well, this is the origin of ImageNet, that like they used Mechanical Turks to label all these images. And so ImageNet is now fundamentally woven into, say, especially visual generative AI. It's but it ultimately came from humans. It's like humans all the way down. This is your article about the Kenyans, and there was a great article recently, just this week, by somebody at Mozilla Foundation looking at like the human engagement and like all the different parts of training, which I thought was just a really good explainer for the fact that humans are still involved in LLMs. They're not separable from this.
It's what's the book? I forget the authors. It's called Heteromation. And the argument they make is that human beings are not being replaced, they're being replaced. So that the ATM doesn't replace a human. It just makes you are now the teller when you go and get your money. The self-checkout machine it replaces a particular human, but it doesn't replace humans. So now you are the bagger, right? So what it does is it doesn't eliminate, I mean, potentially at some level, right, it eliminates Ekbia and Nardi. It doesn't eliminate, it might eliminate like a line in a job, but the human's needed. It just moves the human someplace else. So there's a lot of these heteromation tasks that still require humans. It just moves them into a different part of the system. And a lot of these, particularly around like consumer-based things, it just pivots. It makes you are now, the machine allows Schnucks, my grocery store, right? That machine allows Schnucks to employ you as a cashier. So there's still a human. They've just offset the cost of the human, but the human's still there. It's just a human that's now an independent contractor that doesn't work for Schnucks, right? In the way that Uber, right? This is also related to like the notion. These things are also tightly yoked to the gig economy, right? Like nobody works for anybody anymore, right? I don't work for anybody, and I don't own any of my things, right? I rent my employment and I rent all my movies because they're all digital. They're all DRM'd. That's right.
And we're all doing secretaries. I mean, the typewriter enabled that.
So it
enabled that. And,
it just repositions the human opposed. So it's a really interesting. So that notion of they're still there. They're just someplace else. But
arguably, what you see there, arguably though, is consolidation, right? Yeah, it's like the work that was done by the secretary and the cashier has been collapsed into. I mean, there's an endpoint here where you're just sort of a pure consumer, right? Where you are simply making decisions about this is what I want. And, then you are the cashier, you are in some sense, whoever is producing it, right? Potentially that's what you are, is just the final end goal is just the executive and everything else has just been collapsed inside of you.
Which makes humans again important, but in very different ways, right? There's that Ezra Klein piece about imagining that logic in the context of politics, right? So that you can now ChatGPT can be used to generate all sorts of legal documents and legal spam and political spam, which you will then need an AI to then parse and make sense of. So basically at that point, you've offloaded the legal and political enterprise. It's just bots talking to each other.
That's in our second product, right?
Yeah, it's just there's just too much to read, because you can now write the way the legal system works. You can just keep spamming it with motions that will be impossible to keep up with.
Yeah, there's a great book called The Demon of Writing by Ben Kafka, who very helpfully points out the irony of his last name. But he's talking about the French Revolution and how there was a kind of sense at the revolutionary government that everything should be put in writing. There should be no things that exceed writing. There should be no conversations between diplomats. There should be or bureaucrats. There should be nothing that's not in writing. And, it's a fundamentally the world should be parsable, legalistic kind of approach, right? And he points at some trial where, some bureaucrat is charged with signing a thing that, has some consequences, right? And the bureaucrat is I just sign all the things. I cannot read all of the things, there's just too many documents. And he talks about the impossibility of doing otherwise. All you can do is be a signature in that space. And this is a kind of pre-automated space, but bureaucracy, of course, is an automated space. But yeah, that kind of, my work with Tim LaQuintana has been about this in some ways too. It's when we get into a system where there's so much writing that's happening, some of it automated, but it's just too much, then there's an impossibility of reading. And that kind of, I think that the scale matters. And that, piece that you're talking about by Ezra Klein, I think, sounds like it's pointing to that. I'm gonna have to look that up and read it, but
yeah. No, I'm now thinking too that Ted Underwood piece about, if LLMs have done anything, it's proven all the post-structuralists and postmodernists, right? I'm just imagining Derrida's thing about the signatures, that is it, right? I haven't read any. I didn't read the thing I wrote. I had a chat bot write it and I just signed it, and that's what makes it mine. Yeah. Okay, well, we are at an hour and a half.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So this is we are not skimping on the episode this week to the audience at home.
I didn't get to my final question, which is, Annette, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, Annette, what's
the answer? Great question.
What would you like this third article to be? I don't know. Just say, if you were to say what's a thesis you would like to read? What's an argument you would like someone to make? And then maybe that's something we can use to grapple with the bag of words that we have for this third piece.
I would say I would love to see a full-throated argument for interdisciplinarity and how collaboration across disciplines is the only way forward for thinking about these kinds of new technologies. And that we need to be part of those conversations, but not in a kind of, I feel I'm afraid I'm going to offend some people with this, but there's a discourse in some humanist spaces that's but we should be there too. You should include us. There's a kind of kicked dog kind of sense to that. Yeah. And I that's not the way forward. So I think that there needs to be a kind of what is it that we have that we can do, and also a kind of fundamental respect too for these technologies and understanding how the technologies work, that it's not just we can swoop in and talk about ethics in some authoritative way, because I don't think we can. But the space of generativity, let's say, is in the in-between, and collaboration is really hard. And it involves, longstanding conversation, mutual respect, and knowledge that's generated together. I think it's a hard case to make, in the face of folks who say, you can't be part of this conversation unless you know how to write your own LLM. But I think, the stakes are too high. So I don't know. That's a kind of answer, I guess.
I love it.
Jeremy, did you write that down?
I did. I've been taking notes. Have you been hearing my keyboard clacking away? If so, I apologize. We were talking about technologies. I had to get a clacky keyboard because it feels like you're doing something.
Love it.
Our lab recently got a typewriter so that our students can do more analog. I mean, speaking of this, my contribution to this is my public writing class this fall. They're doing zines.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
So that it literally makes, if you want to circulate this, the circulation depends upon your material capacity to make copies of it and give it to people. As opposed to just, because I explain the project to students are like, so I'll just do an Instagram page. I'm like, no, I want to materialize how's this stuff get from point A to point B.
Well, I think that's great, because it's like LLMs too, right? Like it's making decisions that were once default intentional. So, if publication was default in certain ways, like what you're doing is saying like, no, actually there's a series of choices here for publication and circulation. And like we're looking at this way, that's like a friend system and materiality or whatever, but like LLMs, like it's also like used to be the default. Like we would just, of course, like you write, like you're just a human writing, but of course, like that's also giving a lie to the fact that like writing is always been collaborative. It's always been shaped by technology. It's always been, in these other spaces, right? It's just that like the default has been, we've had certain assumptions around the default, but it's breaking down those assumptions, right?
I think even with the notion of grading at the level of school, I feel like a lot of this is a lot of, chickens coming home to roost, or right. A lot of years of fucking around. And I think we're about to find out, right, that I think a lot of it's like, I think LLMs, I mean, you try how LLMs work, and it's like, I think that's what I do when I talk, right? That this word that I just said, like, as we all know, when we start writing, you get to the end of that sentence, I'm like, this sentence was writing itself, because as soon as I said this, it was more likely that I was going to say that.
Who isn't a word predictor?
Yeah. Right. Like, we're all in longish term relationships. I try to be the best LLM I can be for my spouse. Like, that's
there's a great South Park about that. I don't know if you've seen the South Park where they look at ChatGPT, but you need to watch it.
Okay, good. All right, so you gave us a book to think about, some articles to read, in a South Park episode.
Yep.
Also, you keep us posted on your book project, because
thanks. Yeah, I'm excited.
I really think, the what if it had been the shitting duck? What trajectories would have?
Love that.
Yeah, maybe we just should all co-author some sci-fi at some point.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, it's great.
Okay, well, Annette, thanks so much for giving us all your time.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is great. I appreciate the conversation and the questions.
Yeah.
All right.
This has been fantastic. All right.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation. So we'll need to think about that last bit about like, what do we do? Do we want to make a kind of overt pedagogical, or
the interdisciplinary thing ratchets up, I think, the conversation we were having earlier about the pedagogical implications. And potentially, I mean, what I also like about it is as the third piece, it potentially puts a neat bow on the nature of this project itself, right? Like the people we've mostly had people from our own neck of the woods on. Yeah.
So you see it as a maybe broader audience?
Potentially. Yeah. I mean, I think that could be interesting, right? In the trying to make a compelling but not overwrought argument for, the kind of two-part argument of the need for a interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to this, and then what then rhetoric and composition might bring to that.
We'd have to think about the reader, right? I mean, like and the honest audience, is it for people in other disciplines? And if so, we probably can't muck around in, stuff that won't be meaningful to them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, unless, the variant, as you suggested, is this should be an interdisciplinary conversation. Here's how we contribute. Then it's still really for us.
It could be the kind of, Yeah, I mean, I really like the nets, like the kicked puppy analogy. Like if you really think you want to get involved in this, here's what we think is a viable way to do that.
Yeah.
That accounts for all the complexities and acknowledges all the other, disciplines or practitioners that would also be a part of this, right? So we're not coming in to resolve this, but potentially coming in as a way to, yeah.
That would mean then, assumedly, what we want to account for in that piece is a good faith encapsulation of the other players, right? That would mean we'd
Yeah.
have to potentially talk to other fields to avoid, because if our contention is this is how we can well, I mean, there's a needle to thread there. But I
Yeah.
mean, if we're saying this is the conversation, here's how we can contribute, we have to give some attention to other people with a seat at the table.
Yeah.
Which I'm not saying is like we can't do it. It's just thinking about what is this piece.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so then what we need to do is give a good faith, this is what the AI people value or whatever, which means we'd have to get a sense of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I need to chew on it some more.
Some of the things that came up there, you were mentioning Ong's connection to Artifice.
Yeah.
So is it crazy to potentially rehabilitate the material that got excised from the last one, which was predicated on Ong?
Yeah.
I mean, that matrix was from Ong, and later, I think maybe like Ulmer was in that mix. I'd have to look. But if we're talking about Artifice, I would just say, potentially, if we're talking about Artifice and that stuff comes up, we potentially could look at the stuff that got excised from the second one and see, does it fit better here? Even just a gesture to this question of the artifice of readability.
Yeah, and it would also too, like that piece too is, and as sort of came out in our conversation today too, tracing a little bit of the historical trajectory too, right? That this conversation we're having is a deeply rooted conversation in these particular ways, and so the way that historical perspectives also contribute in this thing, like we don't need to reinvent the wheel discursively, at least in this conversation, right? That what extent conversations and terms are out there that give us some purchase on these issues.
Even as, which was more or less how it was being used in the second one before we realized it wasn't a good fit. Really, you realized it wasn't a good fit, is what conversation, it's just context.
Yeah.
It's like, this is a perpetual conversation about, stretching back at least as far as orality, through literacy to wherever we are now, which may not be resolved.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just something to consider that popped out. Yeah.
Whew. Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate that she had. I was kind of kidding about what should we do, but she had a crisp answer.
I know that was
had a crisp answer. Do this.
Do this. I was like, oh, great. Yeah, we were mostly doing as well. That's sometimes I feel like a lot of the things that happen in this project, we're doing a bit that somehow ends up paying off in some way.
My whole life.
Yeah.
Bits.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, good work.
Yeah.
We got some other guests lined up. We'll announce those on the socials.
Yeah. Once they get locked down, because I don't want to have a thing where, I don't know why, where it's like, you know, I don't want to bring a person into it unless they're, for their privacy as much as anything, you know?
Yeah.
But we've got some other folks.
Yeah, we don't want our following Turks stands to unleash on these people.
It's just best practices. I do
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
I do
You're
it even for the last man on earth.
yeah, people are getting flamed on Twitter. They said you were going to be on next week and you weren't. Where were you? Did you? Yeah, be awful. I know our fans can be pretty aggro. So
Play like you practice and practice like you play.
yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, I will talk to you in a couple weeks, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. See ya.
All right. Later.